The morning sun peeked through the expensive curtains of the guest house, casting long shadows across Margaret Chen's carefully arranged living room. At 80 years old, she sat in her favorite armchair, one that her son Michael had picked out, like everything else in this perfectly decorated space. Her small, weathered hands rested on the smooth fabric, remembering how they once moved swiftly through her own restaurant kitchen, creating dishes that brought smiles to countless faces. The security camera in the corner blinked its red light steadily, a constant reminder of her golden cage. Margaret glanced at it briefly before turning her attention to the Chinese drama playing on the massive TV screen before her. She wasn't really watching. Her mind wandered to the life she'd left behind just 2 years ago. Back then, she'd lived above her restaurant, the Lucky Dragon, in a cozy apartment filled with the aromas of ginger and garlic. The place wasn't fancy like this guest house in Michael's mansion, but it had been hers. Every morning, she'd walk down to the kitchen, prep ingredients for the day, and chat with her regular customers who'd become more like family over the 30 years she'd run the place with her late husband. "Mom, I brought your breakfast." Michael's voice cut through her thoughts as he entered without knocking. He placed a tray of carefully portioned food on the table beside her: oatmeal with precisely 5 blueberries, 2 pieces of whole wheat toast, and a small glass of orange juice. Everything measured, everything controlled. "Thank you, son," Margaret said softly, her accent still thick despite decades in America. She reached for the toast, but Michael stopped her. "Take your medicine first," he insisted, holding out 2 pills. "You know what Dr. Parker said about your blood pressure?" Margaret nodded, accepting the pills. She couldn't remember when Dr. Parker had prescribed them. These days, all her medical appointments were handled by Michael. Come to think of it, she hadn't actually seen Dr. Parker in quite a while. "I'm thinking of making dumplings today," she ventured carefully, testing the waters. "Like I used to at the restaurant." Michael's face tightened slightly. "Mom, we've talked about this. The kitchen isn't safe for you anymore. Remember last time when you almost burned yourself? Besides, the cook can make whatever you want." Margaret wanted to protest that she'd never burned herself in 60 years of cooking, that the incident Michael referred to as just a pot that had boiled over, but she stayed quiet. The last time she'd argued, Michael had called Dr. Parker, and she'd slept through most of the next 3 days. "I have a big case today," Michael continued, straightening his expensive tie. "The security team is here, and Mrs. Rodriguez will bring your lunch at noon. Don't forget your afternoon medicine." He checked his Rolex. "I'll try to be back for dinner." After he left, Margaret stared at her reflection in the black TV screen. The elegant silk blouse and perfectly styled gray hair belonged to someone else. Where was the woman who'd come to America with nothing but a suitcase full of dreams and recipes? The woman who'd worked 18-hour days, who'd put 2 children through college, who'd been known throughout Chinatown for her legendary soup dumplings. She looked at the framed photos on the wall, all carefully selected by Michael. There was one of him winning a big case, another of him shaking hands with the mayor. But none of the old photos from the restaurant. None of her daughter Lisa, who lived in Toronto and who Michael said wanted nothing to do with them anymore. The security camera blinked its red eye watching. Margaret turned back to her Chinese drama, but her mind drifted to the hidden photo she kept in her pillowcase, a faded picture of her whole family at the restaurant's grand opening, everyone smiling, Lisa and Michael still young, her beloved husband still alive, her eyes still bright with independence. A tear rolled down her cheek as she heard Mrs. Rodriguez's footsteps approaching with the vacuum cleaner. Another day in the golden cage was beginning. But deep inside, in a place even Michael couldn't monitor, a small flame of defiance still flickered. The woman who had built a life from nothing wasn't completely gone. She was just waiting, though for what, she didn't know. She just knew that somehow, someday, something had to change. The alternative was watching that last spark of herself fade away entirely, leaving nothing but an elegant, empty shell in this beautiful prison. As Margaret sat in her usual spot by the window, her mind drifted back to when everything began to change. It wasn't sudden. Like water slowly filling a boat, the control had seeped in so gradually she hardly noticed until she was already sinking. It started 5 years ago, right after her beloved husband passed away. She'd been at the restaurant, trying to lose herself in work, when Michael showed up in his expensive suit, concern written all over his face. "Mom, you need to rest," he'd said, placing his hand over hers as she chopped vegetables. "Let me help with the business stuff. Your English isn't as good as mine, and there's so much paperwork these days." At first, it seemed wonderful. Michael hired an accountant, organized the files, and made everything look professional. He'd always been the smart one, the achieved one, top of his class in law school, youngest partner at his firm. Margaret had been so proud, telling all her customers about her successful son. But then the help started reaching into every corner of her life. It began with small suggestions. "Mom, why don't you let me handle your mail?" These scammers target elderly Chinese immigrants. Then came the bigger changes. "Your arthritis is getting worse. You should sell the restaurant before something happens." Margaret's hands trembled as she remembered signing the papers. Michael had explained everything so quickly, shuffling documents in front of her, pointing where to sign. "Trust me, Mom. I'm protecting you." The restaurant sold for much less than she thought it was worth, but Michael said it was a fair market value. Then came the day he announced he'd sold her apartment too. "It's not safe for you to live alone anymore," he'd insisted. "Look what happened to old Mrs. Wu, fell down her stairs and nobody found her for 2 days." His voice had been full of concern, his arguments so logical. "Come live in my guest house. It's bigger, newer, safer." Margaret looked around at that guest house now, so perfect and cold. She remembered how Michael had packed up her things, deciding what to keep and what to throw away. "These old photos are all faded, Mom. We'll take new ones." But those old photos had held her memories. The day they got their American citizenship, Lisa's high school graduation, the restaurant's first review in the local paper. The worst changes came after she moved in. Her old friends from Chinatown tried to visit, but Michael always had reasons they couldn't come. "Mom's not feeling well today. We're renovating. The security system is being upgraded." Eventually, they stopped trying. Her phone disappeared one day. "It's outdated," Michael said, giving her a new one with only 4 numbers programmed in: his office, the security team, and the housekeeper. When she asked about calling Lisa in Toronto, Michael's face darkened. "She abandoned us, Mom. She doesn't care about family anymore." But had she? Margaret touched the hidden photo in her pocket. The last time she'd seen Lisa was at her father's funeral. There had been tension with Michael, harsh words exchanged. After that, Lisa's calls became less frequent until they stopped altogether. Or had they? Sometimes Margaret wondered if she was missing something, like a crucial ingredient in a recipe she used to know by heart. Even her small joys disappeared one by one. The kitchen was declared unsafe. Her morning walks became supervised outings. Her favorite Chinese dramas were replaced with approved programming. Each change came with a reason, each restriction wrapped in concern and love. The garden outside her window bloomed with flowers she hadn't chosen, tended by gardeners she wasn't allowed to speak with. She used to grow Chinese vegetables in her little rooftop garden above the restaurant, bitter melon climbing up strings, tender pea shoots reaching for the sun. Now she watched other people plant and harvest, everything perfectly maintained but untouchable. A notification popped up on her tablet, time for afternoon medicine. Margaret stared at the reminder, another piece of her life controlled by invisible hands. She remembered being strong once, remembered running a business, raising children, building a life from nothing in a strange country. How had that strong woman disappeared so completely? The security camera blinked, ever watching. Outside, the perfectly manicured lawn stretched like a green ocean, beautiful but impossible to cross. Margaret touched the jade pendant she always wore, the one thing Michael hadn't managed to upgrade or replace. Her husband had given it to her the day they opened the restaurant. For strength, he'd said. She wondered what he would think if he could see her now. In the distance, a bird flew freely across the sky. Margaret watched it until it disappeared, a familiar ache in her heart. Somewhere out there, beyond these gilded walls, her old life waited like a half-remembered dream. She just didn't know how to find her way back to it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Margaret's room as she tried to focus on her breathing exercises. The house felt especially empty today, its silence broken only by the gentle hum of the air conditioning. She hadn't always been this anxious. Back in her restaurant days, she'd handled busy dinner rushes without breaking a sweat, juggling orders and managing staff with the confidence of a general. Now, even the thought of walking to the mailbox made her heart race. Was it age, or something else? The new pills Michael insisted she take made everything feel fuzzy around the edges, like looking through a steamed-up window. Some days, she could barely keep her eyes open until dinner. Mrs. Rodriguez, the housekeeper, entered with a gentle knock. "Time for your tea, Mrs. Chen." She placed the cup on the side table, always the same herbal blend Michael had chosen, never the jasmine tea Margaret loved. But today, Mrs. Rodriguez lingered, glancing at the security camera before leaning in to adjust Margaret's shawl. "My mother was like you," she whispered, so softly Margaret almost missed it. "Always sleeping." Then my sister checked her medicine. She straightened up quickly as footsteps approached from a hallway. Michael appeared in the doorway, home early from work. "Everything okay in here?" His tone was pleasant, but Mrs. Rodriguez stepped back quickly. "Just bringing Mrs. Chen her tea, sir." "Thank you. That'll be all for today." Michael's smile didn't reach his eyes. After Mrs. Rodriguez left, he turned to Margaret. "Mom, I've been thinking. Perhaps we should find a new housekeeper." Mrs. Rodriguez seems distracted lately. Margaret's heart sank. Mrs. Rodriguez was the only person who still talked to her like a normal human being, not a delicate piece of porcelain. "She's good worker," Margaret protested, her English slipping as it did when she was upset. "She knows how I like things." "That's the problem," Michael muttered, almost to himself. Then louder, "Don't worry about it, Mom. I'll handle everything." Those words again. "I'll handle everything." Like he'd handled her bank accounts, her property, her friendships. Margaret watched as he checked his phone, probably already composing Mrs. Rodriguez's termination letter in his head. Later that evening, alone in her room, Margaret pulled out the small notebook she kept hidden inside an old Chinese dictionary, the one place Michael never looked. Her hands shook as she wrote the date and a single line, "Mrs. Rodriguez tried to tell me something about medicine." The notebook was full of similar small observations, "Feeling very tired lately. Can't remember what happened Tuesday. Michael says I agreed to sell the jade bracelet, but I don't remember." Little breadcrumbs of clarity in a fog of confusion. She thought about her friend Chen Ai, who used to come every weekend to play mahjong. The last time she visited, she brought traditional Chinese medicine for Margaret's arthritis. Michael had shown up during their visit, insisted the medicine was unsafe, and escorted Chen Ai out. "She means well," he'd said, "but we have to trust real doctors." Margaret hadn't seen Chen Ai since, or any of her old friends. The guest house's windows looked out over beautiful gardens, but they felt more and more like the bars of a cage. Sometimes she caught herself talking out loud just to hear a voice speaking Chinese. At night, when the house grew quiet, she would sneak into the bathroom and stare at her reflection. The woman looking back seemed to fade a little more each day. Her sharp mind, the one that had managed a successful business for decades, felt wrapped in cotton. Even her memories seemed to be slipping away, like water through cupped hands. She thought about the restaurant's last day. Had she really agreed to sell it so quickly? The papers Michael had her sign. Has she read them all? Her old customers must wonder what happened to her. Did they think she'd just abandoned them? After 30 years of serving their families, celebrating their weddings, watching their children grow up. The security camera's red light blinked steadily, watching even in the growing darkness. Margaret touched her jade pendant, its smooth surface cool against her fingers. Somewhere in her mind, a small voice was screaming, trying to break through the fog. Something was deeply wrong, but every time she tried to focus on what it was, her thoughts scattered like startled birds. She opened her notebook again, adding another line, "Must stay awake, must remember." But even as she wrote, her eyelids grew heavy. The pen slipped from her fingers as another perfectly measured day in her golden prison drew to a close. Rain tapped against the windows of Margaret's guest house, creating a gentle rhythm that reminded her of busy nights in her old restaurant kitchen. She sat in her usual chair, half dozing in the afternoon quiet, when an unfamiliar sound cut through the rain. A car door slamming, voices at the gate, the security system's sharp beep. She didn't bother looking up. Nobody ever came to visit her anymore. But then she heard something that made her heart stop. A voice she'd thought she might never hear again. "Mom? Mom, are you in there?" Margaret's eyes flew open. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw a figure hurrying up the garden path. Even after 10 years, she would know that walk anywhere. Lisa, her daughter, her baby girl. Her hands trembled as she rose from her chair. Was this another dream? The medication often made her dreams feel so real. But then the door burst open and there stood Lisa, soaking wet, her face a mirror of Margaret's own when she was younger. "Oh, Mom," Lisa's voice broke as she took in the sight of her mother, thinner, grayer, smaller somehow than she remembered. "What has he done to you?" Margaret couldn't move. She wanted to run to her daughter, but her legs felt frozen. "Lisa, is really you?" Her voice came out in a whisper. "Michael said, he said you didn't want." Lisa crossed the room in 3 quick steps and wrapped her arms around her mother. Margaret breathed in her daughter's familiar scent, mixed now with rain and something else. Strength, determination, the smell of airplane travel and distant places. "I've been writing to you, Mom. Calling, for years." Lisa's voice shook with anger and grief. "Michael said you were too sick to talk, that you didn't want to see me. But Mrs. Rodriguez found my number. She called me last week." A noise at the door made them both turn. Michael stood there, his expensive suit slightly damp from the rain, his face a mask of controlled anger. "Well, isn't this a surprise? Dear sister, finally remembering you have a family." Lisa stepped in front of their mother protectively. "Enough lies, Michael. Mrs. Rodriguez told me everything before you fired her. The medications, the security cameras, the blocked calls." Margaret's head spun as she looked between her children. The fog that had clouded her mind for so long seemed to be lifting, burned away by her daughter's presence. "Lisa, you really wrote to me." "Every week, Mom. I sent photos of your grandchildren. Birthday cards. Chinese New Year money." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "Michael sent them all back. Said you were too upset by them." Grandchildren. Margaret's heart clenched. She had grandchildren she'd never met. All those years of silence, of thinking her daughter had abandoned her. "It was for her own good," Michael said smoothly. "After what you did, leaving us like that." "After what I did?" Lisa's voice rose. "You mean after I caught you forging Mom's signature on bank documents? After I threatened to report you to the Bar Association? That's why you turned her against me." Margaret sank back into her chair, memories flooding back through the medication haze. The argument at their father's funeral. She'd thought it was about Lisa moving to Toronto, but now she remembered snippets of conversation. Lisa shouting about missing money, Michael's face twisted with rage. "Mom needs me to take care of her," Michael said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Look at her, she can barely manage on her own." "The doctor agrees." "Which doctor?" Lisa pulled out her phone. "Because I called Dr. Parker last week. He hasn't seen Mom in 3 years. Says you cancelled all her appointments." "Who's really prescribing these medications, Michael?" The rain drummed against the windows as silence fell in the room. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him for the first time in years. When had his eyes become so cold? When had her ambitious, successful boy turned into this stranger? "Security will escort you out." Michael reached for his phone, but Lisa was faster. "Try it. The police are already on their way, and elder services, and the bank fraud department." Lisa's voice was steel. "It's over, Michael. Mom's coming home with me." Margaret felt tears rolling down her cheeks, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of sadness. The fog was lifting, the cage door opening. She reached for her jade pendant, feeling its strength flow into her. Outside, new sirens joined the sound of rain. Margaret Chen, who had crossed an ocean to build a new life, who had run a successful business for 30 years, who had raised 2 children alone in a foreign land, stood up from her chair. It was time to be strong again. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Police officers moved through the guest house, taking photos and notes. A kind-faced social worker sat with Margaret at the kitchen table, gently asking questions while Lisa held her hand. Each answer seemed to lift another layer of fog from Margaret's mind. "Mrs. Chen, can you tell me about your restaurant?" the social worker asked, her voice warm and patient. "Lucky Dragon," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I known it 30 years. Best dumplings in Chinatown." She paused, confusion crossing her face. "But Michael say I sell it, for good price." Lisa squeezed her mother's hand. "Mom, I have the sale document here." She placed papers on the table, copies she'd obtained from the county records office. "Look at the price." Margaret put on her reading glasses and her heart nearly stopped. The number was barely a quarter of what the restaurant was worth. This must be a mistake. "I never agreed to." She stopped, staring at her signature at the bottom. But something was wrong. The Chinese characters of her name were slightly off, written by someone who had copied rather than lived them. "That's not my writing," she whispered. More revelations followed as officers brought out boxes of documents from Michael's home office. Bank statements showed massive transfers from Margaret's accounts, money from the restaurant sale, her retirement savings, even her jade jewelry collection that Michael had claimed was being cleaned. "Found these in his safe," an officer said, placing a stack of unopened envelopes on the table. Margaret's hands trembled as she picked them up. Letters from Lisa, dating back years. Birthday cards with children's handwriting, her grandchildren, whom she'd never met. Photos of family gatherings she should have been part of. "He kept everything from you," Lisa said softly, "and then he made you think I'd abandoned you." A medical examiner looked through Margaret's prescriptions, her frown deepening. "These medications," she began, checking her notes. "They're often used to treat much older patients with severe dementia. There's no medical justification for this combination in your mother's case." She turned to Lisa. "You were right to be concerned. This level of sedation." Margaret thought about all the days she'd spent feeling fuzzy, confused, too tired to question anything. The way Michael insisted she take her pills, watching until she swallowed them. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. But the final blow came when the financial investigator arrived. He spread out documents showing where Margaret's money had really gone, not to safe investments as Michael had claimed, but to offshore gambling accounts. High-stakes poker games, private sports betting rings. Her entire life savings gambled away by the son she'd trusted completely. "Mrs. Chen," the investigator said gently, "your son has been using your identity and assets to cover significant gambling debts. The forged documents, the isolation, the medications, it appears to have been an elaborate scheme to prevent you from discovering the truth." Margaret sat very still, taking it all in. She thought about her husband, how proud he'd been of their son becoming a lawyer. "Use your skills to help people," he'd always told Michael. When had their ambitious son turned into this stranger who could steal from his own mother? Through the window, she watched as officers led Michael out to a police car. He walked with his head high, still wearing his expensive suit, still looking like the successful son she'd bragged about to her restaurant customers. But now she saw what was beneath that polished surface, a desperate man who had betrayed every value she and his father had tried to teach him. "I want to see everything," Margaret said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "All papers, all accounts, everything he hid from me." She turned to Lisa. "You help me understand." Lisa wiped tears from her eyes, nodding. "Everything, Mom. We'll go through it all together." The social worker smiled encouragingly. "Mrs. Chen, you should know. Your friend, Mrs. Rodriguez?" She kept detailed records of everything she observed. "Her call to your daughter probably saved your life." Margaret touched her jade pendant, thinking of the quiet housekeeper who had risked her job to help her. So many years of fear and fog, of doubting her own mind, of feeling trapped in a golden cage, but she hadn't been as alone as she'd thought. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, falling across the papers that told the story of her stolen years. Margaret Chen straightened her shoulders, feeling more awake and clear-headed than she had in years. "I want my restaurant back," she said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. After everything she'd learned today, after all the pain and betrayal, this one truth remained. She was still the woman who had crossed an ocean and built a life from nothing. And she could do it again. The police station's family meeting room felt cold and impersonal, but Margaret sat straight-backed in her chair, her jade pendant giving her strength. Lisa stood behind her, a protective presence, as they waited for Michael to be brought in. After 3 days of investigations, he had finally agreed to talk. The door opened, and Margaret barely recognized her son. Gone was the expensive suit, replaced by wrinkled clothes from his overnight bag. His carefully styled hair was disheveled, dark circles under his eyes making him look older than his years. 10 minutes, the officer said, closing the door behind him. Michael sat down heavily, not meeting their eyes. The silence stretched between them like a deep river, years of lies and manipulation flowing beneath its surface. Why? Margaret's voice was soft but clear. Why you do this to your own mother? Michael's hands clenched on the table. I never meant, he started, then stopped. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The first time was just a small amount. I was sure I could win it back. The first time? Lisa's voice crackled with anger. When was that, Michael? When did you start stealing from Mom? He looked up then, and Margaret saw something she'd never seen in her ambitious, controlled son's face: shame. 5 years ago. After Dad died. I'd been gambling online for a while, but I could handle it. Then I lost a big case at work, and there were these high-stakes poker games. Margaret thought back to those days after her husband's death, when Michael had been so helpful, so concerned about her finances. The restaurant money, she said quietly. You lose it all? Michael's face crumpled. I thought I could fix it. There was this system. I just needed more capital to make it work. But then the debts got bigger, and the people I owed money to. He ran his hands through his hair. I had to keep you quiet, keep you from asking questions. The medications were just supposed to make you less anxious, but then they made you so much easier to control, Lisa finished, her voice hard. You drugged our mother to hide your gambling addiction. I protected her. Michael suddenly shouted, his calm facade cracking completely. Where were you when Dad died? Off in Toronto with your perfect new life. I was here. I handled everything. You handled it by stealing her life savings. Lisa shot back. By forging her signature? By cutting her off from everyone who cared about her? Enough. Margaret's quiet voice cut through their argument. Both her children fell silent, looking at her. Michael, you are my son. I change your diapers. I work 18 hours every day so you can go to good school. Become lawyer. She took a shaky breath. But I not recognize you anymore. Tears filled Michael's eyes, real ones, not the calculated display of emotion he'd so often used to manipulate her. Mom, I'm sorry. I'll fix it. I'll find a way to pay everything back. No more fixes, Margaret said firmly. No more control. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn photo, the one she'd kept hidden in her pillowcase. It showed their whole family at the restaurant's opening, everyone smiling with hope and pride. This my son in picture. He care about family. About honor. You. She stood up slowly. You stranger wearing his face. Michael stared at the photo, his shoulders beginning to shake. All his carefully constructed walls crumbled as 30 years of his mother's disappointed gaze bore down on him. I didn't want to be a failure, he whispered. Dad was always so proud of me. When I started losing, I couldn't let anyone know. So you make your mother prisoner instead. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. You think that make father proud. The truth hung in the air between them, heavy as storm clouds. Michael buried his face in his hands, broken sobs escaping him. Not the calculated tears he used to manipulate her all these years, but the raw grief of a man finally facing what he'd become. Lisa moved to comfort him out of habit, but Margaret held up her hand. No, she said softly, he must feel this pain. Must understand what he do. She stood up, her small frame somehow filling the room with quiet dignity. I talk to police. Tell them whole story. Maybe they show mercy because you my son. But you not in charge anymore. She touched her jade pendant one last time. Time for mother to be strong now. For both my children. As she turned to leave, Michael's voice cracked behind her. Mom, please, don't go. Margaret paused at the door, memories of her little boy overlapping with the broken man before her. I always be your mother, she said softly. But trust? That like broken jade. Even if you fix, cracks still show. She straightened her shoulders. You find your way back to honor, maybe we find way to be family again. But not today. As the door closed behind her, Margaret felt a strange mixture of grief and freedom. The son she'd known was gone, but so was her cage. Outside, Lisa waited with car keys and passport. Their flight to Toronto left in 3 hours. It was time to meet her grandchildren, to rebuild what had been stolen, to begin again. After all, she thought, Wasn't that what she did best? 1 year later, the kitchen of the Toronto Community Centre buzzed with activity. Steam rose from large pots, the air rich with the scent of ginger and garlic. Margaret stood at the front of the room, her silver hair neatly tied back, demonstrating the proper way to fold a dumpling wrapper. Not too much filling, she explained to her eager students, her English more confident now. And always pinch edges tight or soup leak out. Around her, 20 pairs of hands attempted to copy her skilled movements, creating dumplings of various shapes and sizes. The cooking school hadn't been her idea initially. After moving to Toronto with Lisa, Margaret had spent her days getting to know her grandchildren, catching up on all the years she'd missed. But something had still felt missing. "You're restless, Mom," Lisa had observed one evening, watching Margaret reorganize the kitchen for the third time that week. "You miss teaching people about food, don't you?" That conversation had led them to the community center, where they discovered many Chinese immigrants and their children wanted to learn traditional cooking. Margaret's first class had 5 students. Now, a year later, she had a waiting list. "Teacher Chen." A young woman held up her dumpling proudly. "Is this one better?" Margaret smiled, inspecting the careful folds. "Much better. You practice at home, yes?" The door opened and Lisa peeked in, holding Margaret's youngest grandchild. "Mom, ready for your special guests?" Margaret's face lit up as her advanced students filed in. Elderly Chinese women who'd become more than just students. They met twice a week, cooking and sharing stories of their own experiences as immigrants. Together, they'd created a small business selling homemade dumplings at local markets. "Mrs. Rodriguez." Margaret hurried to embrace her former housekeeper, who'd flown in from California for this special day. After everything that happened, they'd stayed in touch, and Mrs. Rodriguez had become like family. The community center called, Lisa announced, grinning. "Your cooking classes are so popular, they want to offer you a permanent teaching position, with a real kitchen setup and everything." Margaret's eyes grew misty. A year ago, she'd felt trapped and helpless. Now, at 81, she was starting a new chapter. Her recipes, passed down through generations, were being shared with a new community. Her grandchildren were growing up knowing their grandmother's love through food and stories. The healing hadn't been easy. There were still nights when she woke up disoriented, reaching for the jade pendant that now sat in a special box, a reminder of both pain and strength. Michael was getting help, attending therapy and gambling addiction meetings. He wrote to her sometimes, careful letters full of remorse and small steps toward recovery. She wasn't ready to forgive yet, but she'd started reading the letters instead of sending them back. "Okay, everyone back to work." Margaret clapped her hands. "Today we learned secret of perfect dumpling soup. Recipe from my grandmother, her grandmother before her." She paused, looking around at the eager faces. "But first I tell you story. Story about strength that looked like weakness. About finding voice when others try to silence you." As she spoke, her students gathered closer, drawn in by the quiet power in her voice. This was another gift she'd discovered, the ability to share her experience to help others. Some of her elderly students had their own stories of control and isolation. In Margaret's kitchen, they found not just cooking lessons, but community and understanding. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as Margaret demonstrated the precise way to roll out dumpling dough. Her movements were sure and strong, her voice clear as she explained each step. From somewhere in the building, children's laughter drifted in, her grandchildren playing after school, growing up in a world where their grandmother's strength was a living example, not a faded memory. In Chinese cooking, Margaret told her class, "We say good soup take time, cannot rush. Same with healing." She smiled at Lisa, who was attempting to wrap a dumpling with one hand while holding the baby. Same with family. Sometimes must break apart before can come together stronger. Later, as her students packed up their attempts at dumplings to take home, Margaret looked around the kitchen, her new domain, so different from her old restaurant, but somehow just as satisfying. On the wall hung a framed photo of her first class, next to a news article about their successful dumpling business. Below that was a child's drawing of Grandma teaching cooking, proudly created by her oldest grandchild. Mrs. Rodriguez helped her clean up, their comfortable silence born of shared understanding. "You know," the older woman said softly, "when I called Lisa that day, I was so scared. But looking at you now." Margaret squeezed her friend's hand. Life funny that way. Sometimes worst thing lead to best thing. She looked out the window at the setting sun. I think maybe I'm not just teaching cooking here, teaching courage too. As she locked up the community center kitchen that evening, Margaret Chen, cook, teacher, survivor, mother, grandmother, smiled to herself. Her father had once told her that a pearl forms when sand irritates an oyster. From pain come beauty, he'd said. Walking home through the Toronto evening, surrounded by the sounds of her new community, Margaret felt the truth of those words. She had lost much, but gained more. And every dumpling she taught someone to make was another small victory, another thread connecting past to future, weakness to strength, lost to love. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning again, one dumpling at a time.